This is a new Sigma 28-45 f1.8 art lens, a incredibly fast aperture zoom lens in a relatively manageable form factor. And as someone like myself that loves fast aperture lenses, and especially the 28 and 50 millimeter focal length, is this my dream lens? Let's check it out. For typical disclosures, this is from Sigma. I have to send it back to them as soon as this video is over. I'm not being paid. They're not seeing this video before it's published, any of those kind of things. And while it will be available in both Sony E and Leica L mounts, I knew that I was going to be going on the Lumix trip to Japan, and I wanted to be able to take some of these samples while I was there on an off day when other people weren't going to be around. So that's why I will be reviewing it on the Lumix S5 II. Now, as some of you may have guessed, this is sort of the full frame mirrorless. It's the culmination of that super popular 18-35 f1.8 that was made in an APS-C mount on a DSLR mount. It's been incredibly popular for filmmakers for years. And while it doesn't exactly replicate that in some ways, this is an amazing lens that, I mean, 1.8, that is a typical prime lens category, and you're getting a zoom lens, albeit a little bit tight in its focal length territory there. But let's talk about this thing, see the pros and cons, and see if it's really worthwhile. So while this is a Sigma Bigma in a way, it isn't that big. The range from 28 to 45 also isn't that big, but obviously the key feature here is going to be that f1.8 constant aperture in a zoom lens. Now, it's boring, but I'm going to give you the specs so you don't have to go look them up later if it's something you're interested in. This thing that has 18 elements in 15 groups. It has an 11 bladed aperture, close focusing to 30 centimeters, which at 45 millimeters is a, I believe, 1:4 reproduction ratio. Thankfully, it comes in with 82 millimeter filter threads, unlike the Canon that I believe has 95, so you don't have to go buy some crazy large filters. It has an internal zoom, which is very nice, both in terms of size and weight, but also balance. And even though I don't even own a gimbal, obviously that's going to be helpful for gimbal users, but also just to have a better balanced lens that's not going to be changing significantly as I'm shooting is still helpful. It also comes in at just under 1 kilogram. So the Leica L mount version comes in at 960 grams and the Sony E mount version comes in at 950 grams, which in comparison to the other fast aperture zoom lenses is still significantly lighter than those ones. And then I actually just got the email telling me the price, and it's going to come in at $1,349 in the US. Now, all those things are cool, but let's check out some images and see what this thing actually looks like in practice, and then we can talk more about who it's for, what it's good for, and also compare it to things like this. So to be honest, I found this thing to be very, very good. Obviously, it's a little bit large. Carrying it around on your shoulder all day is going to make it kind of dip a little bit, but at under 1,000 grams or, 1 kilo or whatever, it's not like over the top. So just for context, if you've used any of the other lenses, I'm going to list off their weights really quick so you can kind of have an idea of what this feels like. So the Canon 28-70 comes in at 1,430 grams. This Samyang 35-150 comes in at 1.32 kilograms. And then the Tamron version comes in at 1,165 grams. And then while they look fairly similar here, the big advantage of this one is it's all internally zooming. So I don't have to lock this as I do with this one. And as you see, as it zooms out, we're getting a significantly larger footprint here, albeit this lens goes to 150 millimeters at f2.8. So very different than the maximum length of 45 millimeters. So as far as image quality goes, though, on this thing, I found it to be fantastic. There were a few times when I was purposely trying to get just specific things at shallow depth of field. There was a time that I was just at an intersection and wanted to get a bunch of bokeh and things. And you can see that towards the edges, you're getting some kind of funky shapes and some things that aren't exactly perfect, but nothing that I would consider to be any bit of an issue at all. Just kind of like a lens character thing. As far as chromatic aberration goes, it seems to have a lot less than some of the other Sigma lenses that I've used. And it does come at a more traditional kind of like green and magenta in those kind of colors, unlike the 28-70 and the 24-70 that I found. And I've definitely found this, at least on the S5 II, to be very sharp, even wide open, even at full resolution. I've honestly not had any issues as far as image performance goes. Also, this thing being an art lens, it has multiple custom function buttons. It has a full aperture ring. Obviously, it's going to have a zoom ring as well as a manual focus ring. The aperture can be clicked and declicked. You just have the full functionality of any modern art lens. Now, I think for me at least, the biggest question is going to be, is 28-45 really a large enough of a spectrum to really be worthwhile? Obviously, we have this lens like the 35-150. We have the Canon that is a 28-70, albeit an f2 instead of an f1.8. If I go and look at my Lightroom catalog, the vast majority of photos that I take on a professional wedding, at just anything that I'm doing, always fall in between that 28-50 millimeter range. And when I'm doing professional work, I always have more than one camera on me. So having a lens that gives me a wide-ish focal length into a standard focal length frees up my other camera to have something like an 85 or a 135 or something like that, and really just gives me a lot more flexibility in that area. I'll also say that I've had zero issues using this lens at 1.8. So other than the times that I want a different aperture, I wouldn't be feeling like I was compromising using this versus using like the S prime lenses from Lumix. And while the Sony GM f1.4 primes are just like ridiculous in every way, I could definitely take a very slight compromise in the aperture that's coming in to have that added flexibility. So is this a do-it-all lens? Obviously, it's not going to be wide at 24. Obviously, it's not going to be tighter than 45, but that 45 millimeter focal length really is close enough to 50 that it works well for me. A lot of times I'm actually using 50 millimeters vertically and then cropping to a 3:4 aspect ratio. So having that tiny extra bit of width is something that actually works for me. And then to be honest, if I wanted to use one lens for something like a wedding, sure, I would rather use something like this 35-150 because it covers so much more ground. But I always have two cameras on me anyway, so being able to have a slightly shorter range with a slightly faster aperture can actually be more useful because I'm going to be covering almost every event I ever do with two cameras anyway. The fact that it is smaller, lighter, and internally zooming also helps quite a bit, especially if I'm going to be carrying around something all day long. So while not perfect, sure, I would have much rather had this be a 24-50 or even like a 28-60 or something like that. It still fits the bill. I think that $1,350 is a fantastic deal for something like this. And ultimately what I love is there are just so many different options out there. You can have something really small like the 28 to 70. You can have a great workhorse like a 24 to 70. You can also get something like this that's a 28 to 45, but it has a 1.8 aperture. And just depending on what your workflow is like, how many cameras you're bringing, all that kind of stuff, all of these different lenses can fit that type of bill. It mainly just comes down to what your actual needs are as a photographer or videographer. So while this does have some compromises, it is about as close to a perfect zoom lens as I have ever come across, because I think the size is just small enough that is worth carrying around. And while I would have loved a tiny bit more reach, it definitely fits the bill for the vast majority of photos that I take, and f1.8 is wild for a zoom lens. So thanks again to Sigma for sending this out. I definitely have to send it back, which is a bummer. But if you have any more questions, let me know in the comments down below. I might see if I can do a follow-up video. And I personally have lots of deciding to do in terms of all of these different options that are coming out recently. It's just a really exciting time to be in the camera space, so I hope that you have been having fun with all these new releases as well, and hopefully these videos are helpful in deciding what lenses might be great for you. So if you're interested in checking out my video on the 35 to 150, you can check that out here. Check out my new video on the Sigma 28 to 70 version 2, and I'll see you in one of those videos.